Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. I'm joined today by my friend and comrade Andrew Polk, who is the co-founder of Trivium China, and perhaps his most important title, a non-resident senior advisor at the Freeman Chair. We're doing something a little bit different today as a public event. Rather than this being sort of more formal presentations, what Andrew and I wanted to do is present some analysis in process, by which I mean we've been having a series of informal discussions over the past few months, trying to make sense out of both the discrete individual policy moves we've seen coming from a variety of regulatory actors starting this summer, but zooming out to see the big picture in terms of where she and the party leadership might be trying to nudge the regulatory and governance mothership. And of course, this comes at a time, we're about to have the sixth plenum beginning November 8 through 11. And of course, the big one next fall sometime, we'll have the 20th Party Congress. So there's a lot of moving parts here, and I think we're all metaphorically, touching some part of the elephant. And so what this is really a first draft attempt to summarize where we think things stand, what we think the big picture regulatory architecture is, but also what are some of the key drivers and assumptions that are leading to some of these regulatory moves. So appreciate everyone being a part of this, and welcome either at the Q&A, via the chat function, or afterwards. Would welcome feedback, comments, criticism, because again, just to stress, this is a first draft here. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through the slide deck that you see on the screen here. Andrew and I are going to alternate back and forth as we look at different parts of the slide. We're going to try and get through this in about a half hour. That way we can keep 15 minutes or so for Q&A, but knowing myself and knowing Andrew, we may actually end up taking the entire 45 minutes. So let me, with that, get right into it. Andrew, why don't I turn it over to you? And again, thanks to everyone for joining.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Jude, and for having me. We do think this is an incredibly important discussion, and as Jude said, it's something we're sort of continually refining and thinking through. But I think the biggest notion that we're kind of grappling with is the idea that we really have truly entered a new paradigm when it comes to Chinese policymaking. And I would even say, I often characterize it as an inflection point. And obviously the thing about inflection points for policymakers, businesses, investors, others, is that it's very hard to recognize those inflection points when you're in the middle of them. And yet we see some pretty clear signs that there's just a new policy thinking, a new framework that we'll go through today that's driven at the highest level of the Chinese policymaking apparatus, specifically, of course, under the hand of Xi Jinping. We think what's really important to understand is that there's a new governance model taking shape, and that the Communist Party has literally redefined the goals of governance in the past 18 months, although that's been a buildup for several years now. Specifically, the goal now is to create a great modern socialist nation, as Xi has articulated, by 2035. And it's important to recognize that, because what the goal of development has been for the past 2 decades has been to create a moderately prosperous society. And at the 100th anniversary of the party, they basically said, okay, we achieved that goal. The Deng era governance goal of achieving a moderately prosperous society has been achieved. And now we are remaking the fundamental goals and priorities of what governance is meant to do, which is to create a great modern socialist nation. Now, that might seem esoteric, but we're going to get into some of the details around that. But we think it's critical just at the outset to say, if the goals of governance have changed, the very goals of development have changed, then we're going to see new frameworks for accomplishing those goals. And we're going to see changes in sort of real time in terms of policies and decision making from the Chinese government. Because if you're trying to achieve new goals, you're going to use new tools and make different decisions. And so we think that that's a really important framing for seeing how Chinese governance is evolving, and we'll walk through some of the specifics of that. Before we go on to the next slide and talk about some of the specifics, we think it's important to really emphasize that Beijing is not prescient, and that there are headwinds to these new goals and this new agenda. And so we're not drinking the Kool-Aid here saying, oh, well, now they have these new goals, this is what they're going to achieve. Reality gets a vote here, which means everything we're describing will certainly be in flux. And, we can have a discussion around whether or not they will be able to achieve their various governance and development goals, whether there will be unintended consequences, whether external factors will support or impact their decision making. But we think as a level set, it's good to think through what the new goals are, what the impetus is, what the new frameworks are, so that we can at least understand sort of the motivations behind policymaking in China. If you can go to the next slide, Jude. We think it's really important to conceptualize this as the third stage of Chinese socialist development, as is often articulated by Chinese scholars. We call that more pithily PRC 3.0. So there was the Mao era, there was the Deng era, and there's now the Xi Jinping era, as he calls it, the new era. And one reason we think it's important to understand that this is 3.0 is you look at a lot of new policies that are coming out of Beijing, things like common prosperity, that have been around a long time, and people say, oh, well, this is Xi Jinping going back to the Maoist roots, the Leninist roots. And we do think that there is an element of that return to those roots. But really, we should conceptualize this as a third evolution, right? It's not just Mao all over again. And we'll get into some of specifically the goals of common prosperity today and how they differ from how common prosperity was sort of articulated when the goal of Chinese governance was about class struggle back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? So this is some of the same language, but a very different sort of end, and we think will likely be a new means. Two key pieces of evidence to see that we are really on a new path. One is at the 19th Party Congress in 2017, the principal contradiction in the party constitution was changed. This is only the third time we've had a new principal contradiction. And it may seem esoteric or very high level, but fundamentally, all policy is meant to address what the party sees as the current principal contradiction that it is trying to solve. Now, they can't really solve it, but policy is meant to address those things. And effectively, when the principal contradiction was changed, it was changed from what it was under Deng Xiaoping, which was basically the tension between China being poor and the need for development, so the accumulation of resources. And now it's about unbalanced development, specifically the need for China's development vis-a-vis or layered against, quote, the Chinese people's need for a better life. And so this is where you get things like common prosperity, right? The previous goals, fundamental goal of development for the past several decades was to accumulate resources, to have a rising tide lifting all boats, to become rich. Now it is about making China strong, and by doing so, or as a support to that, sharing the resources of development more equally. And again, you think about common prosperity. This isn't, Xi Jinping being a bleeding heart and thinking, oh, we need to bootstrap everyone. His thinking, and Jude will get into this in particular, is a strong country doesn't have a huge amount of economic inequality, because that leads to divisions in the populace, it leads to strains, it leads to can lead to extremism and those kinds of things. So common prosperity is about strengthening China's overall society, overall development path, and strengthening China as a country. So that's that principal contradiction. Even though it was changed in 2017, we're really starting to see the fruits of that now. Another big kind of marker of PRC 3.0 is going to be next month at the 6th plenum, when the party will undertake they'll make a statement on history. And as many of you will know, when the party talks about history, they're not actually looking backward. What they're articulating is their vision for the future. The party has only adopted a resolution on history 3 times, once in 1945, once in 1981, and specifically in 1981, it was looking back at sort of the pluses and minuses of the Mao era. And the whole point was to close the book on the Mao era and to start the Deng era. Now, this is the 3rd time they will have adopted a resolution on history. And in our view, this is very much an effort to close the door on the Deng era and to really further open the door and set the stage for the new era under Xi Jinping. Some of the things that will be involved in this are, again, moving away from accumulation of resources and towards tackling environmental degradation, specifically through technological innovation. One reason that we think it's important to emphasize that is often in our conversations in the US and elsewhere, we see environmental policy and industrial policy as separate, but the Chinese see them very much as connected to each other in order, again, to create a strong nation. So a strong nation has technological innovation. Also, a strong nation shouldn't be hugely environmentally negligent, right? And so the thinking is among leadership that they can kill those 2 birds with 1 stone, that they're intimately linked. If you address environmental degradation, you also win the green technologies of the future to have an industrial policy that makes your country strong, both domestically and globally. Finding new drivers to get China through the middle income trap will also be important. Again, this is about building the middle class, bringing people up from the bottom. This is another one where we've sort of seen them talking about this for years and years and years, and everyone says, oh, well, if they would have wanted to have consumption be a driver of the economy, they would have done it years ago. They say this, and it's just they can never get it done. But part of the reason they could never get it done is because they had different development goals for the past several decades. Now we have a new set of development goals, and the key point for us there is that unlocks new policy possibilities, right? We'll get to some of the granular parts of this, but when you change the goal, often your ability and political will to do things that you couldn't do in the past now changes as well, and you can see new policies coming to fruition that for years and years and years, China watchers thought, well, they just don't have the capability or willingness to get this done. Obviously, addressing demographic, the negative impacts of the aging of the population, so the demographic challenges that are now clearly imposing themselves on China is another key input into why we have changed the goals of development. And so we also should know, often I feel like people think about the demographic challenges for China as something that's in the future, because it's been in the future for the past several decades. Well, it's here upon us today. And now it's very clear at the highest level that leaders are concerned about it. And it's a key input into formulating how and why China will seek to design its governance structure and design its development path. Final couple of things here that also we think are really critical inputs are the need to master general purpose technologies. I'm sure all of you will have heard more and more China's emphasis on technological self-sufficiency. So that's a clear one that is becoming increasingly important. And then building a data governance regime, which is separate but related to the technological piece. It's clear that Chinese leaders see data as incredibly important to the future development of the economy and society, and will be an important, getting the data governance piece right will be an important part of achieving the goals that they want to achieve over the next 2 to 3 decades. And in fact, we're seeing that data governance regime start to be populated, right? We got the personal information protection law that that is just about to go into place in a few days, November 1st, the data security law that went into place in September 1st of this year. So they're laying the groundwork there. And that was particularly emphasized about 1.5 years ago when the party specifically labeled data as a key factor of production alongside land, labor, and capital for the first time ever. So they're clearly elevating the need to obviously control data, but also to monetize data, to tax data, to understand who owns data, and to have that data governance ecosystem properly designed to achieve, again, their development and governance goals over these next couple of decades. Finally, they want to forge domestic resilience in the face of global supply chain challenges. So there is obviously an element of Chinese thinking towards their place in the global economy, the place in the global order. That's an element of this. But we do kind of want to emphasize that most of this new policy thinking is driven by domestic factors. Often when we talk about China and Chinese developments in Washington, D.C., we think about, of course, how it's going to impact the U.S., how it's taking place in the context of U.S.-China relations and geopolitical dynamics. And obviously those things matter hugely, and ultimately they're the things that matter for U.S. policymakers. But by far the thrust of this is a domestic push to achieve domestic goals. And we really have to start by understanding what those domestic goals are in order to then back out and think about what the policy trajectory might be for China's place in the broader global order. So let me stop there and toss it over to Jude for the next couple of slides.
Thanks, Andrew. After the crackdown on EdTech this summer, there was everyone remember this 2-week period where everyone was getting out their 3 volumes of Xi Jinping's governance to look for hints about which sector was next. What we thought might be a more helpful exercise is, after 10 years in power, I think we're beginning to get a clear sense of what Xi Jinping's sort of core assumptions or heuristics are. And we wanted to articulate these because as we begin thinking about this framework, the way Xi Jinping sees the world will become an increasingly important input into the functional policy and regulatory outcomes, because after the 20th Party Congress, when he's in his 3rd term, that will really be the single most important factor, is how Xi Jinping is interpreting emergent events and challenges. So here is a short list, and I think you'll see when we unpack some of the main policies that a lot of these are present. Obviously, the first and topmost consideration, and indeed the most consistent element of Xi Jinping's 10 years in power, has been, without a strong party, everything else is for naught. With a weak party, all roads lead to disaster. So this has been the real functional focus on building the resiliency, organizational integrity, ideological purity, upgrading the discipline, the kind of Leninist muscle memory of the party, to ensure that it is an effective fighting force, whether that's for policy implementation, whether that's for domestic governance. But this is really the kind of key assumption, is the north, south, east, west, the party leads everything, and without a strong party, nothing is possible. Number 2, and this is important, I think, in light of the volatility and uncertainty coming after the series of political interventions masked as regulatory interventions over the summer, capital markets are an absolutely critical component of Xi's agenda as effective tools for channeling resources, redirecting resources into sectors that are higher priority. So part of this, I think, would be penalizing sectors where they'd like to see, where they're worried about the quote disorderly expansion of capital, right? And so that was into some of the platform economy and some of the consumer-facing technology, which was suffering the wrath of SAMR and CAC this summer. The flip side of that, though, is when Xi Jinping says that they want to penalize the disorderly expansion of capital, you have to wonder, okay, well, where is the preferred orderly expansion of capital, and what is the mechanism by which they're going to redirect? And that's domestic capital markets. And so we've seen this with tools like government guidance funds. Capital markets are just still critical, not only for development, but increasingly, we think, for what Barry Naughton calls grand steerage, to support and bolster industrial policy, but also for redistribution. So this is not about killing capitalism or capital markets. This is about making capital markets socialist. Number three, this now I think is bordering on a cliche. It's become so well recognized, but Xi Jinping is in many ways a techno utopian who sees technological fixes for almost all of the critical governance and economic challenges. Indeed, I think this may be one of the areas where Xi Jinping will be surprised in the downside, rather than the hard, gritty structural reforms that are often needed in a lot of these sectors or challenging areas. I think Xi Jinping sees a technology fix that in many ways will yield positive outcomes for the party. But I think in other ways, that over-reliance on technology in place of more finely grained or finely tuned regulation or structural reforms will yield to some suboptimal outcomes. But whereas Xi Jinping can be very vague in many of his speeches about a lot of topics, he is very, very, very specific when he talks about technology, and he talks about technology a lot. So going back to Andrew's comment on general purpose technologies, since 2013, Xi Jinping has been clearly identifying this new wave of general purpose technologies, perhaps AI as most important, as being a get out of jail free for China, right? This is going to help unlock or tackle some of the productivity or total factor productivity challenges, military modernization. This is going to be a critical input. So across the board, technology is just absolutely vital, and mastering and building technological ecosystems that are self-sufficient and serving the national interest is a key priority. Again, this is one of those where you can imagine a lot of shortcomings to that approach, which we probably don't have time to get into today because we're just trying to articulate the agenda. But nonetheless, the technological utopianism, I think, is real. Next, this isn't about killing the private sector, but this is about making sure Xi Jinping wants a private sector that's much more closely aligned with the national interest. So the discrepancy or daylight between where some of these technology companies, consumer technology companies were going, the levels of profitability, and the kind of quasi-cult status that many of these tech entrepreneurs had built out in non-alignment with the party, those days are, I think Xi Jinping is signaling quite clearly over. So again, one can imagine areas of potential massive overstep by the Xi administration as it tries to more closely graft the private sector onto the national development goals. But nonetheless, that is clearly, the takeaway from the past 12 months. Next, looking around the international investment environment, I think Xi Jinping, and rightfully, sees a no longer benign, ecosystem for China. So global integration is still absolutely critical and necessary. And indeed, Xi Jinping has been talking about the need to more closely align or make China's domestic market even more attractive to the international economy. But I think what he's also saying is, the fat years are over, and so we should expect a more hostile international environment. This is behind the push on, finding new tools to circumvent supply chain choke points. And then also, I think the big one is Xi Jinping is saying across the board, global integration and national security need to be seen as flip side or different sides of the same coin. These are not distant realms. These are one and the same, or need to be seen as more closely aligned. So a supply chain choke point, or an entity list, or export control leverage against a Chinese company like Huawei. This is now the new international arena which China will have to navigate. You've seen some of the downstream policies follow from that. Final two, Andrew already mentioned, but data governance and control is essential to national security as well as economic prosperity. And then finally, when we've seen some of the crackdowns over the summer on celebrity culture, I think what's clear is Xi Jinping is saying, look, the civil society and popular culture is not a domain separate from the national interest. We are going to be making more regular interventions to make sure there's a more quote unquote healthy culture, which will have downstream effects in terms of the readiness of our youth for the coming struggle. So I think this is just a clearly more activist approach. So what are we seeing take shape in terms of, if these are the assumptions and Andrew laid out the goals, what are some of the big pieces of this policy agenda? And again, we could fill 100 slides with 1,000 different policies, but I think the kind of the four pillars or the four corners of the policy agenda, which will be operative through the 20th Party Congress, by which I mean the entirety of the 20th Party Congress period through 2027. I think for the key pillars already evident are common prosperity, the new development framework, dual circulation, and then the kind of the 14th five-year plan, which essentially operationalizes a lot of these. I have tried to choose a appropriate Xi Jinping quote for every one of these that gets to the heart of what these individual macro policies do. On common prosperity, I think a lot of us were scratching our head about, did Xi Jinping just become a rabid egalitarian? And if you read the speech that was just published in Chosher magazine 2 weeks ago, and I'd like to credit the folks at Nate's Han for this translation, there is a passage there which I think sheds a little bit more light on why the focus on income inequality and that makes more sense than the idea that Xi Jinping is suddenly going full-blown socialist. And this is his quote by Xi Jinping, where he says, look, we look around the world and we see that polarization and a collapse of the middle class is leading to social disintegration, political polarization, and rampant populism. Aha, that makes more sense to me about why common prosperity as an ideological framework to drive policies that look out to smooth out the rough edges of income inequality. This makes more sense. He sees a social stability problem here. So it's going to be wrapped up in a socialist package, but I think more likely this is about domestic stability and popular legitimacy. And again, he has said common prosperity is a political program. So that's point number one. Number two, on the new development framework, which has been building over the past couple of years, I still haven't seen get sufficient attention that it merits. But the new development framework, which is made up of the kind of new development paradigm, the new development stage, and the new development philosophy or concept, lian, depending on how you're translating it. When you sort of drill down, what I think it's doing is it's basically taking growth or GDP and disaggregating it into various subcomponents that they will watch and monitor that more closely align with, as Andrew said, a shift in the principal contradiction. So they've actually spelled this out in more formal detail, and I'd recommend everyone look at the January speech that Xi Jinping gave on new development. But this is about innovative development, green development, shared development, international development, and I always forget the fifth one. But the point stands that this is saying growth or GDP isn't the right metric. We need to essentially deconstruct this and start focusing on subcomponents and how these interact with the national interest and targeting these. So that's what I think new development is doing in this overall policy framework machine. Next is dual circulation, originally and often I think incorrectly framed as China's kind of quote decoupling strategy. Andrew and I wrote a piece I think, a year plus ago, where we said this was actually a hedged integration strategy, right? So clearly they're saying international integration into the global technology, talent, and capital market is absolutely critical for China's development, but we've seen that this is a hostile environment and we need to do this more on our own terms. And so I think this is more about rebalancing how integrated China is and on what terms, and making sure that essentially it is circumventing or buttressing against the volatilities and unpredictabilities in the international, the global economy, which are, I think, to Xi Jinping, untenable. So this is, as he said, this is about ensuring we've got sort of domestic circulation, i.e. the domestic economy is playing a more important role in terms of economic growth, and while still integrated into the global economy and taking advantage of China's the massive size of our domestic economy and market, we're hedging and protecting against ourselves against some of those volatilities. And then the big gear here in my pretty amateur constructed clip art presentation is the 14th five-year plan, which is still being operationalized in terms of the subnational, provincial and then industry-wide five-year plans. But that really, I think, encapsulates this critical focus on national security, technology, and self-sufficiency. So these put together, I think, are the four pillars of right now the Xi macro policy framework. Some of these are still a bit vague. I think certainly with common prosperity, new development, and dual circulation, these have a long way to go to be to cohere. But that, as folks who follow this regularly know, is the way policy is made. You've got a kind of a broad framework construction at the center. It then gets articulated, and through a series of iterations, lower level units, ministries, provincial governments, industry associations, companies help refine it over a period of a couple of years. And we're in that early phase with, I think, these big three. And so we'll have to watch and see. So Andrew, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jude. So now that we've laid out the big picture priorities, the change in goals, and some of the new frameworks that the party will use to achieve those, I think what we need to think through is both how these changes are impacting policy in a more discrete, real-time way, and what the trajectory might be for other policy changes or policy priorities that we would have even just a few years ago thought, well, that'll never get done in China. So a few things that we can point to as having changed materially, we think just in the past couple of years as this framework started to coalesce, was just the overall macroeconomic management of the economy. Over the past really 3 years, beginning kind of in 2019, senior economic policymakers have been really managing the economy in a different way that is primarily meant to shift away from just stimulus and credit and investment-led kind of economic recovery to a more balanced, targeted program of economic support. We started to see the beginnings of that in 2019. I think it was even more stark in 2020 when China's reaction to the pandemic was to not bring out the big stimulus guns as they did before, because they knew, well, that's going to create more problems than it solves for us, having learned lessons from the 2008-2009 stimulus, but also saying, well, we're trying to do something different here. And you saw really in the language that policymakers used around their macro program was about, really this is about protecting SMEs who create by far the majority of urban jobs, right? So we're really trying to create jobs. That sort of employment piece hasn't changed, but we want good jobs. We want a better environment for smaller businesses, and we want to be able to help them in a more targeted way. Now, again, you can say, oh, well, they've said they want to support SMEs for a long time, but they have rolled out very discrete and specific policy programs to do so. And what they haven't done is really ramp up credit and investment like they've often done pretty much every time the economy slowed over the past 2 decades. And if they're willing to take that more measured, untested path on the back of the pandemic, I think that's very strong evidence that this is an enduring change in macro management. And we're still seeing it today, specifically in the way they're holding the line on the property market. Anyone who watches the Chinese economy day to day has been completely surprised at just how much pain the top economic officials have been willing to stomach as the economy clearly is starting to slow after its economic recovery from the pandemic, as well as additional COVID-19 outbreaks in China, power crunches throughout China, and this policy-induced property slowdown. Normally they'd say, okay, we're going to ramp things back up through property investment, but they have been, even though we were all surprised, we shouldn't have been, because for the past year and a half, top policymakers have consistently said we are not going to use the property market as a lever to stimulate short-term growth. And they've said, repeated Xi Jinping's phrase, property is for, or houses should be for living in, not for speculation or for investment. And so that is a very concrete, fundamental change to policy procedure in real time that I think is driven by these new broader policy goals and frameworks, governance goals and frameworks. Related to that, this renewed push to push through a property tax. For years, the conventional wisdom was China can never push through a property tax there. It's too risky economically. There's too many officials who have their wealth tied up in property. They'd have to disclose their property. But that is starting to happen, pushed by very senior officials. Not only Xi Jinping, but Han Zheng, the executive vice premier, is really in charge of rolling out the pilot program that the state council has just officially put its imprimatur on. And so, talk to people in China who say, and you can say, we've had this conversation where we'll say, well, they if they were going to do a property tax, they would have done it, right? Nothing's ever happened. And the response from people on the ground is, yeah, exactly. Nothing's ever happened. It's happening now because things are different. And again, that to me is a very concrete change that emanates from all these higher level alterations in priorities and development goals. Of course, all that's wrapped up in the de-emphasis of growth targets, and as well in the past year of the crackdown on the tech industry and the private sector, more generally steering capital away quite aggressively from platform companies because they're not seen as being as innovative as they were in the past and as supporting the goals of common prosperity. Now you see the tech companies starting to come back around to the idea. So, but all of this is very salient in terms of setting the context for this re-rendering of the relationship between the state and the private sector. So the question is, well, what else should we expect that might change that the conventional wisdom said China couldn't do for years and years? One, we think, is fiscal and tax reform. A lot of action there on corporate taxes. Nothing concrete yet, but that could snowball quickly. New data governance and architectures, that's already in train. We think that's going to be one of the most enduring and important elements of Chinese governance and policy making over the next 1 year, 5 year, 10-year timeframes. It's critical. More aggressive moves around environmental challenges, and then questions around like what sector, as this policy framework takes further shape, what sectors could open more to foreign investment? What sectors could close off further? Will there be nationalizations that we don't currently expect? So our project now is thinking through, okay, we've got what we think is the framework. What might the significant concrete policy changes of the future be? How should businesses, US policymakers, investors react to that? So I'll stop there and then kick it back to Jude.
Thanks. We're going to go quickly through this because there's 25 questions in the queue and we've got 7 minutes left. So apologies. I did warn that Andrew and I are probably overly verbose. Just a couple final comments here, just to foot stomp some things. We've said this is something new, and I think more time spent thinking about what precisely they're setting out to do, what are going to be the headwinds, how much of this is going to get implemented, what isn't. What is this sort of new stage in China's development look like? What are the rules of the road? How is an increasingly dictatorial Xi administration with increasingly centralized policy decision making. How is that going to interact with some of these policy goals? I think that's just critical. Second, this is emerging, which I said. So, although critical, it's going to take some time to see. And I think over the next year or so, we'll see some of this gel. Again, foot stomp that this is a plan Beijing has, but its ability to predict and shape the future is as limited as every government. So Beijing will both be, reacting and adjusting to domestic and international change as it tries to roll out this agenda. And then final point is, I think oftentimes we're used to poo-pooing initiatives by Beijing if it doesn't kind of fully realize success. So we say things are nothing burgers. I think increasingly, and this has been the case for a while, looking at partial success, 30% success, partial movements is important, because given China's aggregate size, if it makes some headway on any of the big initiatives here, even if it's not fully perfect or fully implemented, that's going to have pretty significant knock-on effects for the global economy. So readjusting our lens here to take partial success and what that may mean. So let me, if Andrew's back on the line, let me just sort of ask a few questions here. And sorry, we've got some really good questions, and I apologize that we're kind of leaving this to the end. Andrew, feasibility on getting out of a middle income trap is the kind of productivity challenge that China's in. Is that circumventable? Or are they going to stay, mired in that trap?
I mean, this is one that's really tough to predict. I'm not one who says just because the Chinese government or the party recognizes a problem, does it mean that they will be able to solve it? But they have certainly diagnosed this. And actually, if you listen to Liu He, who's obviously the economic czar and a vice premier and Xi's right-hand man on the economy, he talks about total factor productivity and the need to boost total factor productivity all the time. We think he only talks about US-China tensions because that's what he was tasked with for a couple of years. But when he speaks to a domestic audience, he is obsessed with boosting total factor productivity. So they're clearly focused on it. I think the pieces around innovation and data governance are really meant to address the issue. Will they be able to be successful? To Jude's last point, I think they'll probably partially be successful. And I think, they may not knock it out of the park, but they'll likely be able to do just enough to keep them moving upward in the development path. And my view would be policymakers, US policymakers, the default should be assume success by China. Because if we just stand back, cross our fingers and assume they're going to fail and get stuck in the middle income trap, well, that's kind of how we got caught behind the eight ball with China's rise and competition to begin with. So I can't, make a firm prediction, but let's just assume that they're going to at least be successful enough to get out of it and plan accordingly.
Am I on? No, I'm on mute. Just a question for a couple of folks have asked about the sixth plenum and positioning himself for a third term. So a couple of thoughts on this. Number one is we're in the middle of another round of speculation that Xi Jinping is gone too far, facing a challenge. I think some people read into Ling Ling's piece in the Wall Street Journal about a property tax, I think incorrectly read that there was sort of local opposition building up. Clearly, with the ability to move forward a history resolution, as Andrew said, only the third time in the party's history, there's still nothing but signs that Xi Jinping is the dominant political figure within the CCP, and that the third term, barring catastrophe over the next 12 months of a massive financial contagion or hostilities in the Taiwan Strait, that the third term is his for the taking. There's always a difference between active grumbling and the ability to mount an effective leadership challenge. And while I myself try to be on guard that I'm not so locked in to my own paradigm of Xi Jinping being untouchable, that we're not missing signs that actually trouble is brewing, just when I drill down to it, it still feels like she is large and in charge. Just quickly, because there's a bunch of questions in here on Taiwan, and I think this is obviously top of mind issue here. I'm not sure this is one to fit in a minute left on this, but just to give a kind of a quick take. I think, if we take these ambitions and goals seriously that Xi Jinping has for a great modern socialist nation, you do have to wonder where a potential military conflict with the United States and even with Taiwan on its own right, where that would fit into that. I think it's clear that the Xi administration, as all previous leadership iterations, have the expressed desire to take Taiwan. And indeed, if you look at the military modernization efforts over the past 3 decades, I think it's clear they're trying to build out the capabilities to do so. I don't think that's actually the hard question. I think the hard question is, do we think that Beijing at the current moment is willing to take the pain and perceived pain to military intervene in Taiwan? And I think again, I'm trying to ram this into a 30-second answer, but I think I still am the equation of, if Xi Jinping wants to stay in power, if the Communist Party wants to stay in power functionally, and if it has this other broader set of ambitions that are about assuring that the Communist Party stays in power by overcoming some of these economic challenges, demographic challenges, the last thing he should do in the near term is mount an invasion of Taiwan. So this is not to rule that out. And indeed, I do worry that the longer Xi Jinping is in power, the more you're going to see risk calculations deteriorate in terms of how accurate they are and how good the qualitative inputs are into that. But we're still seeing Xi Jinping act as a rational actor, and looked across the entirety of his agenda. It's hard to see how in the near term an invasion of Taiwan, or even a sort of an aggressive gray zone action like taking Kinmen Island, would do anything but fundamentally undermine and challenge that. So I think this is a long way of saying, of the decision making into a move against Taiwan, military capabilities are a really important input, but they're not the only input. And Xi Jinping, like any political actor, would be looking across an array of potential side effects and costs for a military intervention, of which an important one is a perception about the United States' willingness and ability to intercede and intervene. So I think it's a more robust set of calculations than I think many. I think most of the focus here is just on military capabilities. We're 2 minutes over, and I apologize, but we're going to have to wrap it up. These are some great questions. I'll take these down. If folks want to get in touch offline, I really do apologize. People put some really good questions in there. I'm sure Andrew and I would be happy to engage with folks over email. So really appreciate the thoughtful questions, and appreciate everyone's willingness to listen to a first draft of this. Welcome feedback, criticisms, comments in any way. If please reach out to me if you'd happy to I think give a copy of the deck if folks want one. So please reach out. But let me just, Andrew, any parting thoughts here before we wrap up?
No, I think you've covered it. Yeah, apologies to everybody that we didn't get to all the questions sort of predictably, but yeah, happy to follow up with people offline for sure.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. Appreciate your time, and have a great day.